There's no easy way to get to Huddersfield. You can take the train from King's Cross and change at Wakefield, or the Manchester train from Euston, get out at Stockport and change again at Staley Bridge, and then straight through on the Trans-Pennine Railway. Anyway, it's a complicated journey. But contrary to popular belief, it's well worth it. I was born in Huddersfield. When I was young, I had very little affection for this part of the country. In fact, when I finished my schooling, I couldn't wait to get away from the place and try my luck in London. But recently, for family reasons, I've been returning here more and more frequently, and in the process, being more and more won over by it. My growing enthusiasm has made me as bad as any other sort of a convert. I imagine that to the casual traveler, Huddersfield is practically indistinguishable from half a dozen other northern industrial towns, but when you really get to know it, you find that it has a personality that's quite unique, very seductive. It's very elusive, the character of this town and its people. Blunt, uncompromising, yes. But there's also a gentleness. The rain falls gently onto the slate roofs. The people seldom raise their voices in the streets, only in working hours, when they have to compete with the rattle of machinery. And the men sing more from the belly than most. Those who think of culture in terms of art galleries and ballet and so on are justified in regarding London as the top culture repository in England. But that's not my notion of culture. To me, it's the way people talk, the way they build, the way they tackle their lives, their attitude to their work and what they do on their time off. It shows itself in the texture of everything around you. I find that Huddersfield people themselves are surprisingly sensitive about the cloth cap image and the suggestion that they're old-fashioned. But it's true, things have evolved more slowly here, and this has contributed to the Huddersfield character. I know that I've become absurdly sentimental about Huddersfield, but I like these old chimneys. I like the noise of the machinery that goes with them. I like the smell of the wool. Huddersfield has a reputation, not necessarily to its discredit, of keeping behind the times. The mill machinery that they use hasn't changed much in 100 years. And the principle of cloth making is practically the same as at the time of the Industrial Revolution. If you ask people why woolen textiles settled for Huddersfield and the surrounding valleys, they will say it's the soft water, and there's certainly no shortage of that. But the real reason lies more in the character of the people themselves. Before the Industrial Revolution, this was a totally rural community. Huddersfield was a market town, and textiles were a cottage industry in the true sense of the word, an adjunct of the farming of the land. People had to struggle for a living here in some of the bleakest and most remote parts of England. And when the winter snow would cut off the villages for months at a time, and the precious water, which was so necessary for the cloth, might well be frozen solid in the streams, nevertheless, hundreds of farmers and their tenants, with the help of their wives and their families, would be working all day long, spinning the yarn, weaving the cloth, in farms and cottages dotted all around on these hills. The Industrial Revolution forced the cottage and village industries together into factories and mills. It mechanized many of the processes, it created whole new supporting industries, and resulted in the vast sprawl which is now the heart of the world woolen textile industry. But many of the original village qualities of both life and geography remain. In fact, Huddersfield is not so much a town as a conglomeration of 40 or 50 districts and villages, tucked into the folds of the Pennines and scattered along the tops of hills. Geographically, Huddersfield retains a unique isolation. It's a sort of urban village, and here, like villagers, everybody knows everybody else. They're self-sufficient. Their isolation is not only geographical, but emotional. They've grown up rooted in a practical, unsentimental way of life. A bloke is walking down the street, stops opposite one of the doors, knocks at it, waits. After a few minutes, door opens, young woman appears, and immediately bursts into tears and closes the door in his face. So our friend scratches his head a moment. He says to himself, "Hey up, what's going on here?" So finally he decides to knock again. After a moment or two, door opens, same young woman appears, bursts into tears, closes the door again. So after a few more minutes, he knocks on the door a third time. This time the door opens and a rather older woman who's more in control of herself appears and says, "I'm sorry, but our Dennis died this morning." And our friend thinks and scratches his head again and finally says, "Did he say out about a pot of paint?" There are 130,000 people in the Huddersfield district, but 70,000 more live in the surrounding villages. These compete against each other, but close their ranks against outsiders. Each has its own cricket team, its own brass band, and, at the bottom of the road, its own mill.
Yes, I am. Very nice.
Here the villagers meet and exchange the gossip of the day.
just with the right weather.
Yes, it was.
News travels down the valleys quicker than the reporters of the Huddersfield Examiner can set it up in print. There's a feeling of unity among these work people, which has little to do with wages or conditions. They're of a kind, they belong. Visitors are received with surprising courtesy, but outsiders offering advice or sporting fancy qualifications impress no one. What they're doing here calls for an astonishing degree of skill. Old-fashioned though it may look, there's no better way of doing this job. Huddersfield is famous for its worsteds, and to produce the fine yarn which distinguishes worsted from ordinary woolens, the wool has to be sorted by hand. It takes a 7-year apprenticeship to develop the touch. The men on the machines need the same sensitive skill. The machines are intricate beyond imagining, but they're just tools. It takes years to acquire the seeming arrogance of the men and women who have mastered them. These girls are menders. A 60-yard roll of cloth may take up to 3 weeks before it's finished. Every knot must be removed, every piece of yarn that's too thick must be pulled apart, and any thread that may have been broken in the looms must be sewn together again. It takes 4 years before they can do their job without supervision. A 4-year apprenticeship would deter most kids leaving school, but not here. They're settled people. They're not going anywhere. True, some of the lads move to engineering down the road, but the young don't drift away much. From such skills, Huddersfield has done all right. Unemployment here is now less of a threat than elsewhere. But the people, working or not, have one thing deeply ingrained, hanging onto their money.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to put £5 in, please.
Outsiders say we're tight, but we regard thrift as one of our more noble characteristics. It's no accident that building societies and savings banks first started in this part of the world.
There you are.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And enough brass has rubbed off to make some Huddersfield folk very rich. It was once said that there were more Rolls-Royces per head here than anywhere else in England. Though nowadays some of the grander Victorian mansions, less than a mile from the centre, are too expensive to keep up, and there are fewer spectacularly wealthy families, the present-day mill owners won't have moved far away. Traditionally, Huddersfield folk live in Huddersfield. Commuting is almost unheard of. The rich are as much part and parcel of the town as anybody else.
They say there are 2 fishes in this pond.
There are 3.
Where?
Look there, there's another one.
No matter how grand, they've always built their pleasure domes within a stone's throw of the works. And within a stone's throw of each other. They mix a lot, very social. It's part of the village way of life.
Hello there. Good to see you. Hello, sir.
Welcome. How's it going today?
A degree of ostentation is not thought unbecoming to the rich. A social do will have all the trappings. But they're still Huddersfield people. As kids, rich or poor, they watched the same cricket matches, listened to the same bands, often started work at the same mill.
Are you here again?
Just telling me about your holiday.
I've never left you a minute, my mother doesn't tell you everything about my holiday.
Next morning I thought I won't get up. Hilary will get the children up. She knows the ropes by now. And
He was a great
she...
Were you a very keen rugby player? Well, I played for the 15. I kept in the second 15, got my second 15 colours, played for the 15, but didn't get my 15 colours.
He was chatting to me at the golf club one Saturday morning when he was well into his 80s.
Really?
Yes. And he said, you know, Ken, I've often wondered why it is some men go bald and others don't.
A little bit overweight there. I put this all down to Edward. I reckon that she's taken after him. I don't...
After the daddy?
Definitely.
The wealthy usually send their kids away to smart schools, but oddly, they seldom drift away either. They're drawn back inevitably to the more traditional world of their parents.
Try to get a job at the Savoy.
Huddersfield's isolation forces people to be interested almost exclusively in their own pursuits, make their own amusements, to be doers rather than watchers. They'll get together of an evening, walk through any of the districts, and you'll hear them.
1, 2, 3, 4. Today on reef representative of ships sailing the seas, each with its Spanish flag or ship signal.
Just a minute, love. At the top of the page, second bar, the V should come on the second beat. On the second beat. Okay, shall we try that?
Representative.
That's it.
Like that.
Exactly right, yes.
Shall we do it together?
Okay, yeah.
Same place.
Please.
Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Today on reef representative of ships sailing the seas.
The house where I was born is in a district called Marsh, which I don't think anyone would describe as being particularly distinguished, except perhaps by the character of its inhabitants, past and present. Down at that end, my friend William Makepeace Lunn lives. That's a name with which many of you are not yet familiar, no doubt. He lives on the right side of the street, but the wrong end of it, status-wise, because the further you proceed down in this direction, the posher it gets, so that in a quarter of a mile or so, it becomes very posh indeed. Mill owners' houses, that sort of thing. That semi-detached house there constitutes the halfway mark and has the distinction of once having been occupied by the great Yorkshire cricketer, Wilfred Rhodes. And this is Croft House, which was my family's home and where, in fact, I lived exclusively until I was about 22 or thereabouts. The employees of the post office quite properly refer to it as number 20 Croft House Lane. Our family was extremely self-contained. My father was a proper businessman. He was a textile merchant. He was not a typical Huddersfield businessman, but he was completely integrated with the life of the community. He was busy, he was always traveling, and consequently he had much less influence on me when I was young than my mother had. My mother was wonderful to us when we were children, and she was a good wife, and she was dedicated to all sorts of local charities, but she went through life with one major frustration. Being well-educated and of an artistic temperament, she always was reaching for a gracious way of life, which was perhaps more than could be expected of Huddersfield. Her attitude in all directions, both towards the disdain for business and the rag trade and in the direction of artistic things, rubbed off on me. And during my teenage, things got worse because not only did I see Huddersfield as a town devoted to business, but a town devoted to business which was unemployed and depressed, black, dirty. Everything's changed now. My own attitude has changed towards Huddersfield. The house is empty. The garden is clean. And if I rub my hand against this tree, I don't expect to find it very dirty. Well, the only thing that's remained constant throughout has been the character of Huddersfield itself. Huddersfield's setting and the inward-looking quality of its people have meant that moral values survive here longer than elsewhere. Unfashionable words like sober and industrious and God-fearing still mean something.
Lord, thy glory fills the heaven, earth is privileged, fullness Lord, unto thee be glory given, holy, holy, holy Lord.
This is the church that our family regularly attended when I was a kid, and consequently this choir was my first exposure to Huddersfield's musical propensities. I didn't know whether it was a good choir or a bad choir. It was just the choir, just as the church was our church. And it wasn't until centuries later, when I was living as an expatriate in California, that an old lady who lived in Holmfirth sent me a recording of the choir that had just won the national championship at the Festival of Britain in 1951. It was this choir, Holy Trinity Church. The phenomenal interest in music grew out of the nonconformist church, which was the big thing in Huddersfield before the Industrial Revolution. Beside each chapel was the Methodist or Baptist school, and children who in other directions might have no education at all were taught to sing and play musical instruments as an act of worship. Many of them learned to read music long before they could write. Although nowadays most people belong to the Anglican Church, the tradition of inciting children to an interest in music has never died.
Yes, that's quite right. Right, now we're going to play it all together. Ready?
How much is this one, please?
£347.
The evening air reverberates, if not always with harmonious sounds, at least with enthusiasm. But sheer noise-making presently takes on a more established form. And later, when the kids mature, the musical spirit of Huddersfield will assert itself. It's a strong, reliable sound, in tune with this community. Solid and honest and settled, and, as I said, seductive. There's an ambiguous and perhaps rather sinister word being bandied around nowadays. Rationalization. People say, if we're to survive, we must streamline the business. We must amalgamate with a huge corporation, which will save a dying industry. But in the past, the people have put up with endless hardships, the exploitation of child labor, appalling work conditions, and industrial relations, sometimes equally appalling. But they've always been united in a common struggle, which they understand. Rationalization could perhaps be the beginning of dehumanization. ICI's new dye-producing complex is run almost entirely by computer. It's a £7 million plant and employs only 10 men to operate it. It works very well, I'm told. Over at David Brown's is the most advanced tractor assembly line in the world. It looks much more what I imagined Detroit to be than Huddersfield. Mass production is the very antithesis of what Huddersfield is all about. Tractors are spewed out from here by the thousand, but the knowing Huddersfield man will view the acres of unsold ones with a wry smile. The right way to do things is the old way, the way they've done it for years in most of the local industries. And why should they change? They're doing all right.
Well, how many looms are we likely to get on that one?
Well, we've promised to put 4 on so that we should get them out for the end of June. There's 25 pieces.
We're in your hands here. Well, how are you doing?
Well, I mean, we can't hold the wool prices because wool's going up all the time at the moment.
Huddersfield's industrial scene is dominated by 200 strictly family businesses, handed down through generations, from father to son, from son to nephew, and so on. It gives business a sense of continuity which elsewhere has practically disappeared.
These have been a very regular line.
The boss's son is as familiar a figure on the factory floor as he is in the family office. He shares a tradition of service which works both ways. You could call it despotic, paternalistic, or what you will, but it's the way they do things here. You know where you are with it.
A couple of pieces of colour 2 here, 3 of colour 3, and 5 of colour 5.
That pile of wool in the corner of Joe Lum's mill has taken 12 years to amass. An unimpressive heap, you might say. But in fact, you're looking at the finest pile of wool in the world, of such incredible quality that it would be quite uneconomic to weave it into cloth. At least that's what they say. So it stays there for visitors to admire and for the management to play with during their lunch hour. I bet they have none of this nonsense at ICI's computerized plant down the road. The idiosyncratic nature of Huddersfield life breeds a special sort of giant. Men from the common mold with a bit added. Such men enjoy the appropriate perquisites of success and rank as considerable citizens. Robert Hanson is one of them.
Bob?
In spite of his age, over 80, he goes to work most mornings, seen off by his housekeeper. It's a characteristic of such men that they do not lightly abandon their enterprises while they still have the strength and cunning to continue them. Robert Hanson built up one of the largest transport firms in the country, starting work at 13, driving a 3-horse team, and later taking over from his father a comparatively small business, and with very little formal education.
No, I didn't like going to school. I didn't like the regimentation and being sat at the desk, birds singing outside and I was inside. I had claustrophobia or something. But one thing my father was very keen on, which stood me in good stead, and that was mental arithmetic.
At the age of 26, he took sole charge of the business, which was then valued at £450.
With 14 or 15 horses, plus those 3 furniture vans. That's what we had intact, beside the harness, the war, and the sheets and that kind of thing. And we kept expanding and extending on because we always used to buy and sell a lot of horses. And then we got into the motor business and we widened our sphere of life. Hours didn't count, you know. 5 o'clock in the morning till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, well, that's as it came. And your men would do the same. Then we started going to Birmingham. Then we bought a place in London with about 300 machines. And then we went up to Glasgow, bought a place there, and bought a place in Birmingham, another in Edinburgh, and one in Leith. And we kept buying.
By the end of the Second World War, Robert Hanson had 30 depots for his lorries and coaches all over the country. Although the haulage business has been nationalized, the vehicles still bear the family name. Coach service, however, remains his own.
We've been a family, a business family, all our lives. We've had people who've either stayed with us a year, 2 years, 3 and 4 years, or they've come and settled down here, you see. But the average time is 29 years they've served us.
This is the list for your staff party, Mr. Hanson. You'll see that there are 70 persons on that list. I think most of them will accept. And Mr. and Mrs. White are hoping to get over from Canada.
Are they?
Yes.
Is Harold Crime over, do you know?
I don't know if he'll be in England in August, Mr. Hanson.
Maybe she could.
Robert Hanson represents perfectly everything Huddersfield stands for. He's competitive, enjoys his success, but he still retains the interest of the carter that he once was. He's an enthusiast for show jumping and has never lost his passion for horses.
We bred a lot, and you go up into the field and these mares and foals would come and you play about with them until they'd be like a dog, they'd follow you anywhere, you know. If I had no horses today, I'd be having crackers. I still have some. There is something about the friendship you have. I don't know what you call it, what you like.
Another family firm that thrust its way into the national scene after starting in Huddersfield was David Brown's. Precision engineering started here towards the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to provide machines for the mills. It has now overtaken textiles as the main employer of labour. David Brown's was one of the largest privately owned firms in Britain. Tailor-made gearing is its speciality, and for this, the highest engineering qualifications are required of 70% of the workforce.
Have you checked all the thermocouples now, Peter?
Yeah, that was the last one, Jeff.
Right, can we check the float in the primary wheel?
Less well known, another successful family engineering firm.
Come in.
Good morning, Mr. Frank.
Good morning, Mr. Ernest. Oh, I've just been looking through your report.
Brooke Motors are electrical engineers, a firm handed down by the late founder to his two sons.
Yes,
Frank Brooke is the businessman, the force behind the organization. He is addressed by his employers as Mr. Frank.
And we also had a film show.
Is this the 200 box that you're doing here?
Yes, this is the 200L, Mr. Jack.
His brother, Jack Brooke, is the engineer. He is addressed as Mr. Jack.
How long do you think it'll be before it finishes?
Well, it's on the last cut now, Mr. Brooke.
You're on the last cut.
Together, they manage the business on traditional family lines, which for Mr. Jack means getting away from his desk as often as possible for a walk on the factory floor. It gives him an excuse to talk to the men and fondle the machinery.
Just a minute, can you tell me where that Landers Fine boring equipment's got to?
Well, this is it, Mr.
Workshop.
In fact, Brooke Motors has ceased to be a family firm, to the brothers' regret. They allowed themselves to be taken over, only because neither of their sons, in exception to the Huddersfield rule, wanted to go into the business.
Keep working the lathe. Come there. Oh, take that one back now. Now, when this gets a bit further, pull this hand out.
Jack Brooke lives and sleeps engineering, at home as well as at the works. If he failed with his son, he sets his granddaughters off on the right lines.
Have you got a shine on it yet? Very good.
Huddersfield men are intensely competitive, both in their business and their pastimes. Practically everybody in Huddersfield is involved in some game or sport, and they take them very seriously. My dad was a terrific fan of the game which has come to be known as rugby league, of which, incidentally, Huddersfield is virtually the birthplace. It seems that at one time, a certain number of northern rugby clubs decided that the time had come for a spot of professionalism, so they split away from the southern clubs, and after a while they further decided to improve the rules. The team that we watched was the champions at the time. They were known as the team of all the talents. They were led by a very glamorous figure called Harold Wagstaff, but I seem to remember that our favourite was a bloke called Dougie Clark. He was a coal merchant in everyday life, and he was a great bulldozer of a man. We loved him. Huddersfield Town were champions then, too, but I wasn't such a keen soccer fan then as I am now. You may be sure that no matter what the game is in Huddersfield, it will always be played at the highest pitch of competitiveness.
Well stopped, lad, well stopped.
The intensely competitive villages fight it out in what's called league cricket. Today, Honley is playing on their home ground.
We stopped to go for there, didn't we? We stopped to go for there, you know. Aye. It's queer, actually, on this ball, isn't it? Very queer. It's some force, I want.
In the valleys, there are as many as 100 clubs. This one seems to be a relatively peaceful event, but it can be very rough at times, especially among the supporters.
I never seen such a silly stroke in that. Just looked down and looked here. He never made a stroke, did he?
He'd have to be halfway across to get there.
No less intense are the passions aroused by Crown Green bowling, a Of this we have 64 clubs.
Come on.
You got in the house?
How many, Tom? How many?
Right. In the 1860s, a popular local sport was clog fighting. The two contestants would take off all their clothes until they were stark naked, except for the clogs on their feet. And they would face each other and put their hands on each other's shoulders, and on the word go, they would start kicking each other on their shins and legs as hard as they could, until one of them was obliged to cry, "Enough." Each village had its champion, and the players, believe it or not, were willing volunteers. Such was the competitive spirit in those days. Today's competitive businessmen meet for a game of snooker and to swap the hot news of the day at the Huddersfield and Borough Club. The talk hasn't changed much since my father was a member.
It's a pleasure to knock on your door and see that gorgeous little thing in long stockings. It's the most beautiful receptionist in the valley, without a doubt.
Delightful.
Absolutely terrific, I think so.
Yeah,
Anyway.
the chairman came in the other day and he said, what can she type? Or I said, I don't know.
Don't tell me some fool
I've never asked her.
I started, I think, when I was close on 67. I was 85 last week. If you'd like me to show you one or two...
Franklin Broadhead has been entertaining the members for years.
You never had any twinges in your back?
No. Well, not that I remember. I might have had earlier on.
He'll perform at the drop of a hat.
You see, I should have joined up in the First World War, but they wouldn't have me. They rejected me 5 times.
Yeah.
So, what would you do? And I'm like this now. See?
He was unfit.
Unfit. So you see what you do?
Yeah.
You see, you were asking me, can I come up like that?
Exactly.
Of course, you see,
No, this
I
is
can come up
fabulous.
without any trouble.
That is difficult.
Yeah. And then what I was going to do before was so this, you see, I'm sure you've got that.
Right here. It's astonishing. I don't know how I managed to keep his trousers in.
Here, personal eccentricities are not discouraged. And the same applies here. Though the regulars are surprisingly conservative.
No, let's go down to... Rastats. No, let's go down to Rastats.
Goukers home today.
Eh?
The Goukers home today.
Are they? They?
Haven't got on foot.
Well, that's marvellous.
But as far as the dockers, they're getting about £40 a week now, and they still want more, and they still want less hours.
But look at it this way. You've 3 bloody gangs working, you've 1 playing cards. What do they get?
The same money as them that's bloody working, isn't it?
And
they're not the same bloody money as holiday
they're
payment.
playing cards for 8 hours a day. Not that particular team, but they swap over.
Politics.
There is no passion more indigenous to Huddersfield than its music. It draws together the people from every walk of life. More people are involved in music here than any other town in Britain. Of an evening, Huddersfield and its valleys can muster 6 performing church choirs, 16 registered brass bands, 1 chamber music society, 1 madrigal society, 3 light opera societies, 3 choral societies, 1 women's choir, 3 male voice choirs, 1 youth orchestra and 2 symphony orchestras. People in the south expect the best music only from professionals. These are all amateurs, with the possible exception of the conductors and chorus masters, and the people here expect them to be the best. And they are, by dint of hard work and deep involvement. The Colne Valley Male Voice Choir was known to be the best in Britain, and the Huddersfield Choral Society is still as good as any in the world.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start 4 bars before the beginning. 4 bars, the second line of page 3. Ready?
This is the Huddersfield Choral Society, in rehearsal.
letter M with the trumpets.
Down the road, the Huddersfield Philharmonic.
Ready? Please, 4 bars before N, where we've just stopped.
God save the King! Long live the King! God save the King! May the King live forever!
Thank you. Look, may the King live forever. Keep the tone alive. May get the M to explode onto the, or at least to be singing on the A already. May the King live. Get through to the vowel immediately. The little the, you must have a precise the on the semiquaver. Everybody, God save the King. And may the King live, right? And.
God save the King. Long live the King. God save the King. May the King live forever. Amen, amen, alleluia, alleluia, amen.
I can see 1 or 2 of you singing with an O vowel instead of an R vowel. You sing O, use the R and the mouth across, and you'll get a far better effect. Basses, what do you just do? You right? I'll give you and. Right? And. Right? And. You're singing it very well, but you look so solemn. Or, you know, you've got faces set somewhere. Could you make it kind of, could your eyes sparkle? Could it be brilliant and bright? And it'll come out in the tone. Could you do alto, lead us in? You can do that better too. May the King live. Try straight. Right? May the King live forever. That's better. Amen, amen, alleluia, alleluia, amen.
Don't really quite get it right, do you? Not only the trombones, but this crescendo in the horns.
So ingrained is music in Huddersfield life that there are more concerts given in the town hall than there are football matches in Leeds. And the house is always full.
4 bars before N, please.
I lived for 16 years in California. During that time, one of my few contacts with this part of the world was a series of letters that I started to receive from an old lady called Mrs. Samford, whom I'd never met. And these were very often accompanied by large cartons of beautiful lantern slides and colored picture postcards, which I studied with the greatest relish as a way of appeasing my then growing sense of nostalgia. This old lady lived in Holmfirth, which is an old village on the outskirts of Huddersfield. Her desire seemed to be to infect someone like myself with her own enthusiasm about the pioneering achievements of her father, who was a gentleman called Bamforth. What most impressed her, perhaps, was his early experiments in the field of motion pictures. Indeed, If the rest of the country had been ready for him, this little village might have ended up as the hub of the British motion picture industry. It was not until much later that I connected his name with a firm of picture postcard publishers which still exists and prospers. Amazingly, 90% of the saucy postcards you buy on Blackpool's Golden Mile originate in this little village. The postcards which Mrs. Sanford used to send me were entirely different from the modern product. The lantern slides were usually based on sort of dramatizations of moral homilies with titles like, Are There Angels in Heaven Who Are Blind Like Me? These were then translated into postcard form, and after that came the serialization of the popular and sentimental songs of the period. These went down particularly well in World War I and immediately prior to it, and I found them irresistible.
There's a long, long night of waiting until my dreams all come true, till the day when I'll be going down that long, long trail with you.
Huddersfield people view with cautious tolerance the artists who live among them. Earlier, I mentioned my friend Wilfred Makepeace Lamb. He's an inventor, or sculptor, or something. Anyway, he makes small cycles that do things.
Morning, Emma. I don't roll that again.
Sit down inside, Richard. Down inside. Excuse me.
The thing is, you see, I look on my bicycles as being satirical, but round Huddersfield, because there's sort of a tradition of model makers, they look at my stuff and they don't think, oh, satirical bicycle or anything like that. They say, oh, it's a bike. The fella makes bikes, you know, and it's acceptable. You see, when you get something like, for example, down in the town, they've got one of Henry Moore's fallen warrior statues, which is sort of more-length shapes and things, and reclining. It's got this sort of feel of it falling, you see. Somebody told me that they'd heard a chap say, well, I've been through 2 world wars, and I've never seen a warrior falling like that. It's taken me a while to build up the various things that I used to make these bicycles with, you know. And I don't think there's anywhere else where you could get people knocking on the door with a bag full of fish-based lids, you know, from the mud guards.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how long would you have to live in London before they do that?
I think you'd have to live all your life.
And it is dearer than fresh salmon, you know.
Peter Brook is more serious. Not that Wilf Lunn isn't serious, but Peter's a realist. To me, everything that he paints evokes every sentimental memory that I have of this part of the country. Not just the mills, but the broken-down houses and the lonely farms up on the Pennines.
I like the roads better around here. Straight and more dramatic. I like these odd telegraph poles and wires. The walls are good as well. Those boundary walls with the topping stones about 18 inches higher than the level of the top stop the sheep breaking back out at lambing time and so on.
Come on, come on. This is the area that I was born into, James. When I get time, I come up here any time of the year. Snow, mist. Keep going.
I once wrote a short poem about this, and I tried to put it down in as few words as possible, and all I can work out is that I was born around here, and my people saw these buildings and maybe helped to build them, for all I know. Because they farmed this land, then when I come up here, I feel as though I'm walking the same roads and same paths and seeing the same things that they saw. But I can't think of any other place that means more to me than this. This is it.
When I'm away from England, I like to have Peter's pictures around me. And when there are no figures in them, my imagination fills in the missing occupants, the people who are rooted here. The people who reject as newfangled what others call progress, who cherish as solid virtues what others no longer believe in. It's a good life. I like it. I'm glad to have been part of it.